On my wedding day, right as the best man raised his glass to toast our future, my phone vibrated with a text from my boss's son. It read, "You are fired. Consider it my wedding gift to you. I am locking you out of the company's servers right now." I stared at the glowing screen, the clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the warm laughter of my guests suddenly fading into a dull hum in the background. I turned my phone and showed the message to my new husband. Instead of panicking, he simply took a slow sip of his bourbon, looked at the screen, and smiled a deeply satisfied smile. 5 hours later, I had 110 missed calls from his father begging me to pick up. Before I dive into exactly how a single arrogant text message brought a multi-million-dollar global corporation to its knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that entitled people always end up digging their own graves, and trust me, you will want to hear how this one buried himself. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old, and up until that exact moment at my sweetheart table, I was the chief compliance officer for one of the largest international supply chain and logistics firms on the West Coast. I was the person who kept the entire operation running within the strict boundaries of federal maritime law. My husband Isaac, who is 35 and a brilliant corporate mergers and acquisitions attorney, was sitting right beside me. Isaac is a striking African-American man with a mind that operates entirely on logic, contracts, and liability. When he saw that text message, his razor-sharp legal brain instantly calculated the catastrophic mistake my former boss had just made. To understand the sheer magnitude of the disaster that was about to unfold, you have to understand the man who sent that text. His name is Trent. He is 28 years old, drives a customized sports car that his father bought for him, and was recently appointed as the vice president of operations. His father is the chief executive officer of the company, and Trent is the textbook definition of a nepotism hire. He has no background in logistics, no understanding of federal customs regulations, and absolutely no respect for the people who actually do the heavy lifting. For the past 6 months, Trent and I had been locked in a silent war. He constantly tried to cut corners to increase his profit margins, attempting to bypass expensive safety inspections, reroute shipments through unverified vendors, and ignore the complex international trade laws that governed our industry. And every single time, I blocked him. As the chief compliance officer, I had the final say on what moved and what stayed. I was the immovable wall standing between his reckless ambition and federal prison. Trent despised me for it. He hated that a 33-year-old woman could tell him no. He hated that his father trusted my expertise over his own son's ideas. So when I requested 2 weeks of paid time off for my wedding and honeymoon, Trent saw his opportunity to strike. He thought he was being ruthless. He thought he was proving his dominance by humiliating me on the happiest day of my life. He assumed that by sending that text and revoking my server access, he was simply getting rid of an annoying middle manager who stood in his way. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually done. When you work in high-level international logistics, your title is not just a fancy string of words on a business card. My role as Chief Compliance Officer was legally bound to the company's operating licenses. I held the primary digital signature for our automated manifest system, which is the direct link to the United States Customs and Border Protection database. Every single shipping container that our company moved across international waters required my active credentials to clear federal checkpoints. I looked down at my phone again, reading his words. "I am locking you out of the company servers right now." I felt a sudden sharp thrill run down my spine. I turned to Isaac, keeping my voice low so we would not disrupt the best man's speech. "He actually did it," I whispered. Isaac let out a low chuckle, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "He just triggered the federal clause, didn't he?" I nodded slowly. The reality of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. At that exact moment, it was 8 o'clock at night. In exactly 4 hours at midnight, the company's most important cargo vessel of the year was scheduled to dock at the port of Long Beach. It was carrying $50 million worth of restricted, highly regulated international freight. This specific shipment had been a logistical nightmare to coordinate, and Trent had been bragging for weeks about how this delivery was going to secure his promotion to Chief Operating Officer. But there was a massive catch. A catch that Trent, in his infinite arrogance, had never bothered to learn about. Because of the sensitive nature of the goods on that ship, the federal government required an active, verified compliance officer to digitally authorize the offloading process. That officer was me. My personal surety bond, $1 million insurance policy that guarantees the company will pay all federal duties and taxes, was hardwired into the corporate server. The system was designed to automatically verify my employment status every time a major shipment arrived. If my credentials were ever revoked, or if I was terminated from the payroll system, the corporate software was programmed to instantly cancel the surety bond to protect me from liability. I discreetly opened the web browser on my phone under the table. I navigated to the employee portal, typed in my secure password, and hit enter. A red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. Account terminated. Trent really did it. He did not just send an empty threat. He had genuinely gone into the human resources portal and processed my immediate termination. In his rush to play the powerful executive, he had blindly severed the company's connection to the federal compliance grid. I showed the red error screen to Isaac. His smile widened, showcasing that brilliant, calculated confidence that made him such a terrifying force in the courtroom. "It is officially done," Isaac said, his voice smooth and incredibly calm. "The surety bond is snapped. They are flying blind." He was entirely correct. Without my active digital signature, that $50 million cargo ship was legally toxic. The moment the vessel attempted to enter the jurisdiction of the Long Beach Port Authority, the automated federal system would flag the company as operating without a licensed compliance officer. The shipment could not legally dock. The cranes could not legally unload the containers. The truck drivers waiting on the docks could not legally transport the goods. The entire operation was about to crash into a brick wall of federal bureaucracy, and there was absolutely nothing Trent could do to stop it. I felt a brief flicker of professional panic, a conditioned response after years of putting out fires for this company. I instinctively wanted to call his father to warn the chief executive officer that his son was about to cause an international shipping disaster that would cost the company millions in fines and delayed delivery penalties. I wanted to be the responsible adult in the room. Isaac noticed my hesitation. He reached under the table, gently placed his hand over mine, and took the phone out of my grip. "Do not even think about it," Isaac said, looking me dead in the eye. "You do not work for them anymore." Trent made his choice. He wanted to be the boss. Let him be the boss. Put your phone on silent, enjoy your wedding cake, and let the timer run out. I took a deep breath, letting his words wash over me. He was right. For years, I had sacrificed my evenings, my weekends, and my peace of mind to keep that company afloat. I had endured Trent's condescending remarks, his blatant disrespect, and his constant attempts to undermine my authority. I had covered for his mistakes more times than I could count, simply because I cared about the hundreds of hardworking employees whose jobs depended on the company's success. But Trent had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He chose to fire me via text message during my wedding reception. He chose to try and break me on a day that was supposed to be about love and celebration. I looked at my beautiful reception. The ballroom was filled with our closest friends and family. The tables were adorned with white roses and flickering candles. The music was perfect. I looked at Isaac, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of corporate chaos that was brewing miles away. "I am not going to let him ruin tonight," I said softly. Isaac leaned in and kissed my cheek. "He already ruined his own life, my love. He just does not know it yet. We are just waiting for midnight." I took my phone back from Isaac, but I did not put it in my purse. Instead, I opened the settings, switched the phone to Do Not Disturb mode, and placed it face up on the table right next to my champagne flute. I wanted to see it happen. I wanted to watch the exact moment when Trent realized that he had not just fired an employee, but that he had pulled the pin on a digital grenade and handed it directly to his father's legacy. The rest of the evening was a dream. We cut the cake, we danced with our parents, and we laughed with our friends. But every time I returned to the sweetheart table, my eyes would flick to the screen of my phone. The digital clock in the corner of the screen slowly ticked closer to the deadline. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 11:30. The anticipation was intoxicating. It was a strange, empowering feeling to know that a storm of unprecedented proportions was about to hit. And for the first time in my professional life, I was not obligated to stop it. I was finally free from the toxic weight of cleaning up Trent's messes. At 11:45, the reception began to wind down. The final song played, and Isaac and I shared a slow dance in the center of the emptying ballroom. As the clock struck midnight, we were stepping into the private elevator that would take us up to our bridal suite. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the noise of the hotel lobby. The elevator car was quiet and intimate. Isaac pulled me close, wrapping his arms around my waist. Just as the elevator began to rise, the screen of my phone, clutched tightly in my hand, suddenly lit up the dim space. Even on silent mode, the visual notifications began to pour in like a waterfall. First, it was the automated server warnings. Urgent Federal Maritime System failure. Critical surety bond terminated. Warning customs clearance denied. The system was collapsing right on schedule. Then came the text messages from the port dispatchers, frantic and confused, asking why the gates were locked and why the cargo was being held in the bay. But the most satisfying moment came just 3 minutes after midnight. The screen flashed with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed Trent's name. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, he called again, then again, then again. I looked up at Isaac. His eyes were dark and amused. We stepped out of the elevator and walked down the quiet hallway toward our suite. By the time he unlocked the door and carried me over the threshold, Trent had already called 12 times. The $50 million domino had officially fallen, and the true consequences of his arrogance were only just beginning to surface. Isaac had just placed my phone face up on the white tablecloth when a shadow fell across our sweetheart table. I looked up to see Simone standing there, a crystal flute of champagne balanced effortlessly in her hand. Simone is Isaac's younger sister. She is 32 years old, strikingly beautiful, and possesses a razor-sharp intellect that misses absolutely nothing. As a Black woman navigating the intense male-dominated world of federal oversight, she carries an aura of absolute authority. Simone is a senior auditor for the United States Customs and Border Protection. Her daily life consists of tearing apart the financial records of massive global corporations and penalizing them for breaking international trade laws. She tilted her head, her dark eyes scanning our faces. "You two look awfully serious for a couple who just tied the knot," she said, her voice smooth but probing. "Isaac is usually the one plotting a corporate takeover, but Gemma, you look like you just watched a building burn down. What is going on?" I glanced at Isaac, silently asking for his approval. He gave a slight nod and gestured toward the phone sitting on the table. "Trent fired her," Isaac said simply. He did it through a text message right in the middle of the best man's toast. He also locked her out of the corporate compliance servers. Simone's relaxed posture instantly vanished. The warm, celebratory sister-in-law disappeared, and the strict federal customs auditor took her place. She set her champagne glass down on the table with a sharp clink. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of the table, and read the glowing text message on my screen. "You are fired. Consider it my gift to you." A slow and dangerous smile spread across Simone's face. It was the exact same smile Isaac had given me just moments before. These two siblings shared a terrifying ability to spot a legal catastrophe from a mile away. "Tell me he did not actually revoke your digital signature on the port manifests," Simone whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. I nodded slowly. "He did. I tried to log into the portal under the table. My access is completely denied." He processed the termination in the human resources system, which means the automated software just permanently canceled my $1 million surety bond. "The company is officially operating blind, without a licensed compliance officer." Simone let out a soft whistle, shaking her head. "This is incredible. This is the most spectacular display of corporate suicide I have ever witnessed. You do realize what is sitting out in the Pacific Ocean right now, do you not? The Long Beach shipment, I replied, keeping my voice hushed so the nearby guests would not hear us. $50 million worth of restricted electronics and battery components. It is scheduled to dock at midnight. Simone's eyes lit up with pure professional adrenaline. She pulled out the chair next to Isaac and sat down, completely ignoring the fact that the wedding DJ was trying to get everyone to the dance floor. I know all about that specific shipment, she said, leaning in close. Trent has been on my radar for the last 4 months. Ever since his father promoted him to vice president of operations, he has been quietly trying to bypass the standard environmental inspections to save money on import taxes. My department has flagged 3 of his smaller shipments this quarter for suspicious cargo declarations. We knew he was cutting corners, but we never had enough hard evidence to freeze the entire supply chain. She looked at me, her expression dead serious. Trent is reckless. He thinks because his father is the chief executive officer, the federal government will just look the other way. He has been complaining to my department for weeks trying to get his cargo expedited. I personally placed a watch order on that $50 million delivery. If everything was perfectly legal and if your digital signature was attached to the manifest to guarantee the taxes, we would let it through. But now, she paused, letting this reality of the situation hang in the air. Now the company has no licensed compliance officer to claim liability for $50 million in restricted goods. The moment that cargo vessel enters United States waters, my system is going to trigger an automatic lockdown. What happens when it locks down? I asked, feeling a surge of vindication. Simone reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a thick black smartphone. It was not a standard consumer device. It was her government-issued encrypted phone directly connected to the Homeland Security database. When the automated system detects that the surety bond has been severed, Simone explained, typing a rapid sequence of security codes into her screen, the port authority will physically lock the gates on their designated loading docks. The ship cannot dock. The cargo cannot be unloaded. Every single hour that the ship sits idle in the bay, the company will be hit with tens of thousands of dollars in maritime delay penalties. And that is just the beginning. She opened a specialized application on her phone. The screen displayed a complex digital ledger filled with tracking numbers and real-time GPS coordinates for cargo ships along the California coastline. She scrolled down until she found the specific vessel belonging to my former company. Because I am the auditor assigned to monitor his shady activities, Simone continued, tapping the screen to highlight the vessel in bright red. I will receive a direct alert the second he tries to force that shipment through without your credentials. Trent is going to panic. He knows his father will destroy him if this $50 million deal falls through. He is going to try to use his own executive override to clear the cargo. He will think he can just authorize it himself because he is the vice president. And he cannot do that, Isaac interjected, crossing his arms over his chest. Because he does not hold a federal compliance license. Exactly, Simone said, her smile widening. If he attempts to electronically bypass a revoked surety bond, it instantly upgrades from a bureaucratic delay to a federal crime. It becomes unauthorized import smuggling. And the moment he tries it, I will be the one who gets the notification. Simone placed her government phone on the table right next to mine. She picked up her champagne glass and leaned back in her chair, looking at the two of us with deep satisfaction. Happy wedding day, Gemma, she said, raising her glass in a toast. You do not need to lift a single finger. You just sit back, enjoy your reception, and let me do my job. The second the clock strikes midnight, I am going to watch Trent single-handedly dismantle his father's entire logistics empire. I looked at the government device sitting beside my own phone. The digital ledger was actively tracking the massive cargo ship, counting down the nautical miles until it hit the jurisdiction line. My anxiety completely evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm and empowerment. Trent thought he had stripped me of my power by sending that text message. He thought he had won. Instead, he had just handed a loaded weapon directly to a federal auditor who had been waiting months for him to make one fatal mistake. Let the timer run out. Isaac reminded me softly, kissing my hand. I smiled, picking up my own glass to clink against Simone's. I was not just a victim of a cruel boss anymore. I was a spectator to his impending ruin. We turned our attention back to the dance floor, leaving the two phones on the table to silently count down the minutes until midnight. The clock on my phone screen shifted to 11:30 at night. The wedding reception was slowly winding down around us. The caterers were quietly clearing the dinner plates, and the disc jockey was transitioning to the final slow songs of the evening. It was a beautiful romantic atmosphere, but at our sweetheart table, the energy was electric with anticipation. Isaac had his arm draped casually around my chair, looking incredibly relaxed for a man who was about to watch a corporate empire implode. Simone was still sitting with us, her eyes locked on the glowing screen of her government-issued smartphone. Despite the absolute certainty that Trent had brought this disaster upon himself, a small wave of guilt washed over me. I was not feeling guilty for Trent or his father, the chief executive officer. My concern was for the ground crew at the Port of Long Beach. The dispatchers, the crane operators, and the truck drivers were all regular, hardworking people. They were going to be the ones standing on the cold docks at midnight when the federal authorities suddenly locked the gates. They would be confused, panicked, and completely unaware that their vice president of operations had just turned their workplace into an active crime scene. I leaned closer to Isaac and whispered my thoughts to him. I told him I wanted to send a quick anonymous message to the lead dispatcher. I just wanted to give them a 30-minute warning so they could tell the night shift crew to take a break and stay out of the crossfire. Isaac looked at me with deep affection, clearly appreciating my empathy for the workers, and gave a gentle nod of approval. I picked up my phone and opened the secure web browser. I bypassed the standard employee portal and navigated directly to the internal dispatch communications network. This was a back-end channel that only senior management could access. I carefully typed in my administrative username and my highly secure 16-character password. I pressed the login button, fully expecting to see the familiar blue dashboard of the communications hub. Instead, the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. A stark white text box appeared in the center of my display. It read, "Access denied, user credentials terminated. Please contact Human Resources immediately." I stared at the screen, a cold realization washing over me. I tried to refresh the page. I typed my credentials a second time, making sure I did not misspell my password. The exact same red screen appeared. "Access denied, user credentials terminated." I slid the phone across the table toward Simone. She glanced down at the red error message and let out a low, impressed laugh. "Trent did not just suspend your account," she said, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "He went all the way. He formally processed your termination through the main corporate payroll software." For the audience to truly grasp the gravity of what that meant, I need to explain how corporate logistics architecture is built. In a massive supply chain company, the payroll system does not just print paychecks. It is the central nervous system of the entire organization. It is digitally connected to the compliance network, the federal reporting software, and most importantly, the corporate insurance policies. My $1 million surety bond, the absolute legal requirement for the $50 million shipment waiting out in the Pacific Ocean, was entirely dependent on my status as an active salaried employee. The second Trent hit the terminate button in the human resources system, the corporate software did exactly what it was programmed to do. It recognized that the chief compliance officer was no longer employed by the company. To protect me from being held legally responsible for future shipments, the software automatically sent a cancellation signal to the insurance providers. In the span of a single millisecond, my $1 million surety bond evaporated into thin air. The company was no longer insured to import restricted goods. The federal compliance license tied to their operating profile was instantly revoked. As of 11:30 on a Saturday night, my former employers were legally indistinguishable from a black market smuggling ring. Simone picked up her heavy encrypted device. The screen was displaying the live map of the California coastline. The digital marker representing the company cargo ship had been glowing a steady green for the past hour, indicating that the vessel was cleared for entry. But as we watched the screen refreshed, the green marker flickered and suddenly turned a harsh glowing red. A notification banner popped up on Simone's federal dashboard. "Automated flag, generated surety, bond terminated, customs clearance revoked, hold order placed. There it is, Simone said softly, her voice practically purring with professional satisfaction. The first domino just hit the floor. The federal database has officially recognized the cancellation. The Long Beach Port Authority system just automatically revoked the docking privileges for that vessel. The trap is now fully set and completely inescapable. I felt a strange mixture of awe and finality. I had spent years building the safety protocols for that company. I had designed the very automated systems that were now locking them out. I knew those systems were flawless, but seeing them execute a total shutdown in real time was breathtaking. Trent thought he was just being petty. He thought firing me was a power move that would make him look strong and decisive. He never bothered to learn how the company actually functioned beneath the surface. He simply assumed that because his name was on the building, the laws of the United States government would bend to his will. Isaac rested his hand gently on my shoulder. "You tried to warn them, Gemma," he said. "You did your part to protect the innocent workers. From this second forward, every single fine, every single penalty, and every single federal charge falls squarely on Trent. You are completely legally protected." He was absolutely right. I had tried to do the responsible thing one last time, and Trent's own monumental arrogance had blocked me from doing it. I picked up my phone, closed the web browser containing the red termination screen, and locked the device for good. I placed it back down on the table, face up, directly next to my champagne glass. The music swelled as the disc jockey called all the remaining guests to the dance floor for the final celebration of the night. The timing could not have been more cinematic. Out in the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, a $50 million cargo ship was sailing blindly toward a digitally locked gate. And back in the corporate headquarters, the massive servers were silently screaming, registering the total collapse of their legal infrastructure. We had exactly 30 minutes until midnight. 30 minutes until Trent's prize shipment hit the federal boundary line and triggered the absolute worst professional crisis of his entire life. I took a deep, relaxing breath, smiled at my brilliant husband, and reached for my tall champagne glass. The company was now operating illegally, and all we had to do was sit back and wait for the magnificent explosion. The transition from the lively reception to the quiet intimacy of our bridal suite was surreal. We left Simone downstairs at the hotel bar, where she was happily sipping her champagne and keeping a vigilant eye on her federal encrypted device. As Isaac and I stepped into the private elevator that led to the penthouse level, the heavy brass doors closed securely behind us, shutting out the sound of the music and the joyful chatter of our wedding guests. The silence in the elevator was profound, but it was not a heavy or anxious silence. I held my own phone tightly in my hand, the smooth glass surface feeling like a ticking time bomb. I was no longer the stressed-out chief compliance officer who had to fix every single mistake my boss or his son made. Thanks to Trent and his impulsive termination text, I was now just a newlywed woman on her way to enjoy her wedding night. Isaac wrapped his strong arms around my waist and pulled me close, kissing the top of my head. He smelled like expensive cologne and confidence. The elevator chimed softly as we reached our floor, and we walked hand in hand down the long, softly lit corridor toward our suite. When Isaac unlocked the door and swung it open, we were greeted by a breathtaking view of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hotel staff had decorated the suite perfectly, with scattered rose petals and softly glowing candles illuminating the space. It was the picture of romance. I walked over to the edge of the king-sized bed, still clutching my smartphone. My instinct, deeply ingrained after years of corporate conditioning, was to turn the phone completely off and shove it into my suitcase so I would not have to think about the company ever again. But Isaac stopped me before I could press the power button. He walked over, gently, took the phone from my fingers and smiled. He told me that turning it off would rob us of the best part of the evening. He advised me to make sure the volume was completely muted and the vibration setting was turned off, but he insisted that we leave the screen facing upward on the dark wooden nightstand. He wanted us to be able to see the exact moment when Trent's massive ego finally collided with the uncompromising reality of federal maritime law. I followed my husband's brilliant advice. I went into the settings, disabled every single sound, and placed the device squarely in the center of the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the digital clock on the screen read 11:50. We had exactly 10 minutes left until the $50 million cargo ship hit the federal boundary line at the port of Long Beach. 10 minutes until the automated customs system realized my $1 million surety bond was gone. 10 minutes until Trent's entire career went up in flames. Isaac poured us each a glass of sparkling water from the mini bar and sat down next to me, taking my hand in his. We did not even turn on the television or play any background music. We just sat there in the peaceful glow of the candlelight, watching that small rectangular screen. I thought about all the times Trent had spoken down to me in board meetings. I thought about his smug face when he tried to bypass safety regulations just to save a few dollars. He genuinely believed that firing me on my wedding day would be the ultimate power move. He thought he was untouchable. The digital numbers on the phone screen shifted to 11:59. I held my breath, feeling my heart beating faster in my chest. Then the numbers changed to 12:00. Midnight had officially arrived. For about 30 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The phone remained dark and silent. A brief, fleeting thought crossed my mind that maybe, just maybe, Trent had figured out a way to manually bypass the system. But then the screen suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the dark corner of the room. The first notification was an automated email from the corporate server. The subject line read, "Critical failure surety bond terminated." 2 seconds later, another notification popped up. This one was from the Homeland Security automated portal. It read, "Customs clearance denied, vessel hold order placed." Then a third notification appeared from the Long Beach Port Authority dispatch network. "Warning, entry gates locked, unauthorized cargo detected." The notifications began stacking on top of each other so fast that the screen could barely keep up. The digital infrastructure of the company was screaming in panic. The entire logistics network was crashing right before our eyes. Isaac squeezed my hand. His eyes locked on the glowing phone. "It is happening," he whispered, his voice filled with deep satisfaction. But the automated server warnings were only the beginning. At exactly 12:12, the nature of the notifications completely changed. The screen cleared of the automated emails and a new incoming call banner filled the display. The caller identification boldly spelled out Trent's name. The phone sat there completely silent without a single vibration, just flashing his name over and over again into the dark room. We watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Less than 5 seconds later, the screen lit up again. It was Trent again. He called a third time and then a fourth. The screen showed a small red circle with the number 5 indicating the missed calls. Then the number climbed to 12. He was relentlessly redialing, panic clearly setting in as he realized the Port Authority was not going to let his $50 million shipment dock. He must have been screaming at the dispatchers only to be told that his own chief compliance officer had been terminated and the federal license was instantly revoked. I imagined Trent standing in his luxury apartment, completely helpless. He could not yell his way out of a federal lockdown. He could not throw money at the United States Customs and Border Protection. The missed call counter on my screen steadily climbed to 18, then 22, and finally rested at 28 missed calls in the span of just 15 minutes. 28 desperate attempts to reach the woman he had so arrogantly fired just a few hours earlier. He was begging me to answer, to log in, and to fix the catastrophic disaster he had created with his own 2 hands. But I was not going to answer. I was not his employee, and I was certainly not his savior. I leaned my head against Isaac's shoulder, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. The phone continued to light up in the darkness, casting a soft glow across the rose petals on the bed. Every single silent flash of the screen was a testament to the fact that actions have consequences. Trent had tried to ruin my wedding day, but instead, he had given me the most spectacular, unforgettable wedding gift I could have ever asked for. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the phone continue its silent, frantic dance. At 3 o'clock in the morning, The glow of the city skyline outside our hotel window was soft and peaceful. The chaotic storm of notifications on my phone had finally gone completely silent. Isaac and I were tangled in the expensive hotel sheets, enjoying the quiet comfort of our first night as a married couple. I was drifting in and out of a deep sleep, but miles away in the cold, salty air of the Pacific Ocean, the situation was rapidly escalating from a severe corporate nightmare into a full-blown federal crisis. Trent was not sleeping. He was sitting in his luxury downtown apartment, staring at his multiple computer monitors in an absolute panic. The 28 unanswered phone calls he had made to me were a clear indication that his initial strategy of screaming and demanding compliance had completely failed. He was out of options. The $50 million cargo ship was sitting idle in the dark waters just outside the jurisdiction of the Long Beach port. The dock workers were standing around drinking coffee on the company dime because the digital gates were securely locked. The terminal manager had already called Trent twice to inform him that if the vessel did not move into its designated slip by morning, they would lose their docking priority and face catastrophic maritime delay fines. Trent had always been a man driven by ego. In his mind, he was the vice president of operations. He was the son of the chief executive officer. He genuinely believed that corporate titles held power over federal law. He reasoned that my role as chief compliance officer was just a formality. He thought that if he pushed hard enough, the system would simply recognize his supreme authority and let the cargo through. He decided he did not need me. He decided he was going to force the gates open himself. What Trent failed to understand was the fundamental difference between corporate policy and national security. A company server will let a vice president override a vacation request or approve a budget increase. But the Customs and Border Protection Network does not care who your father is. It only cares about liability. The system was demanding a valid $1 million surety bond to ensure the $50 million worth of restricted goods. Since Trent had fired me, that bond no longer existed. Sitting in his apartment, Trent aggressively typed his executive credentials into the main logistics terminal. He bypassed the standard employee portal and entered the senior management gateway. He located the specific shipping manifest for the delayed cargo vessel. Right across the center of his screen, a bold warning flashed stating that the compliance signature was missing and the cargo was federally detained. Directly beneath that warning was a small gray button labeled Executive Override. That button was designed to be used only in extreme emergencies, such as a system crash, when a licensed officer was physically present to provide verbal authorization to the port authority. It was never meant to be used by an unlicensed executive to push unauthorized cargo across a national border. But Trent was desperate. He was terrified of what his father would do when the sun came up. He moved his mouse over the gray button, and without a single second of hesitation, he clicked it. He entered his personal administrative password and hit submit. He leaned back in his leather chair, probably expecting the screen to turn green and the port gates to magically swing open. He probably thought he had just saved the day and proven that he never needed me in the first place. He was so incredibly wrong. The moment Trent clicked that override button, he crossed an invisible line that completely destroyed his career. His unauthorized login attempt bypassed the corporate firewall and shot directly into the Homeland Security database. The federal system instantly recognized that an unlicensed civilian was actively attempting to force a locked shipment of restricted goods into the United States without a valid surety bond. Across town in her own hotel room, Isaac's sister Simone was wide awake. She was sitting at the small glass desk in her room, still wearing her silk robe from the wedding preparation. Her heavy government laptop was open, and her encrypted smartphone was resting right next to it. Simone had not gone to sleep. She knew Trent's personality type perfectly. She knew that an arrogant man backed into a corner would inevitably make a catastrophic mistake. At exactly 3:15 in the morning, her encrypted phone let out a sharp, piercing alarm that echoed through her quiet hotel room. The screen flashed bright red. Simone leaned forward, her eyes scanning the incoming data on her laptop screen. The system recorded Trent's exact digital footprint. It captured his internet protocol address, his executive username, and the exact timestamp of his override attempt. Simone smiled a cold, calculated smile. She picked up her phone and dialed the direct line to the Federal Dispatch Center in Washington. She identified herself with her strict auditor badge number and security clearance code. She informed the overnight director that she had a confirmed security breach in progress. Because Trent attempted to digitally force the cargo through the port, the situation was no longer just an administrative delay due to a missing compliance officer. By deliberately trying to bypass a federal blockade, Trent had officially committed unauthorized import smuggling. He had weaponized his corporate access to try and sneak $50 million worth of goods past the United States government. Simone did not just flag the single cargo ship waiting in Long Beach. Federal protocol mandates that if a senior executive of a logistics company attempts to smuggle goods, the entire organization must be treated as a hostile entity. Simone swiftly typed up the authorization forms on her laptop. With a few precise keystrokes, she executed a devastating command. She placed a universal federal hold on the company's entire operating fleet. Every single ship owned by the company that was currently in transit was instantly flagged for secondary inspection. Every truck carrying their containers was ordered to pull into weigh stations for a complete manual search. The company was completely paralyzed. Trent had tried to fix his tiny, petty mistake by using a sledgehammer, and instead he had brought the full crushing weight of the federal government down on his father's empire. Simone submitted the final report, closed her laptop, and finally took a sip of her leftover champagne. She had done exactly what she promised to do. She had let Trent dig his own grave, and then she had quietly pushed him in. The trap was now permanently locked, and there was no way out. The sun was going to rise in a few hours, and Trent was about to wake up to a reality where he was not just unemployed, but actively under federal investigation. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse suite, casting a warm golden glow across the room. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and the city below us was just beginning to wake up. I stretched under the heavy hotel comforter, feeling more rested than I had in years. For the first time in my professional life, I had not woken up at 5 in the morning to check international shipping manifests or respond to urgent emails from overseas vendors. I was officially a married woman, and more importantly, I was officially unemployed. Isaac was already awake, sitting at the small glass dining table near the balcony, wearing a plush white hotel robe and pouring us both cups of steaming black coffee. He smiled at me, a look of pure contentment on his handsome face. He nodded toward my cell phone, which was still sitting exactly where I had left it on the nightstand. The screen was completely dark now, the battery having died sometime in the early hours of the morning after enduring hundreds of frantic notifications and endless phone calls. We were just about to look over the room service menu to order a lavish breakfast when the peaceful silence of our suite was suddenly broken by a sharp, unfamiliar sound. It was not my cell phone. It was the heavy brass landline phone sitting on the wooden desk across the room. Isaac and I exchanged a very confused look. Nobody calls a hotel room landline anymore, unless it is the front desk informing you of a checkout time or a package delivery. I wrapped the thick white bedsheet securely around myself, walked over to the desk, and picked up the receiver. A polite but clearly stressed hotel concierge spoke on the other end of the line. She apologized profusely for disturbing my morning, but explained that a man had been calling the front desk continuously for the past hour. The concierge sounded completely exhausted. She told me that the man claimed to be a senior executive at my company and insisted that there was a life-or-death corporate emergency that required my immediate attention. He had become so incredibly aggressive and unyielding, swearing at the hotel staff and threatening to drive down to the lobby himself, that the concierge finally agreed to patch him through to the bridal suite just to get him off the line. I looked over at Isaac, who was sipping his coffee, with a knowing smirk on his face. He already knew exactly who was waiting on the other end of that connection. I thanked the concierge for her patience, told her she did nothing wrong, and instructed her to put the call through. There was a brief electronic click, and then the incredibly loud and frantic voice of Trent filled the earpiece. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear and reached down to press the speaker button so Isaac could hear every single word of this absolute meltdown. Trent did not say good morning. He did not ask how my wedding reception went. He did not even offer a fake apology for interrupting the very first morning of my honeymoon. Instead, he instantly launched into a hysterical screaming match. He yelled that the $50 million cargo ship was completely locked out of the port and that the terminal manager was threatening to impound the vessel by noon. He screamed that his entire logistics network was crashing. He blamed the entire catastrophe completely on me. Trent demanded that I open my laptop log into the administrative portal and fix what he called a software glitch immediately. He actually had the sheer audacity to tell me that I needed to do it off the clock because he was not going to pay me overtime for a problem that he believed I had intentionally caused. He was completely gaslighting me, acting as if his text message from the night before had never happened. He spoke to me like I was a disobedient child who was playing a silly prank with company property. He demanded that I stop being emotional and get back to work before he lost his temper completely. I stood there listening to his frantic, heavy breathing on the other end of the line, completely amazed by his sheer delusion. When I did not immediately respond to his barking orders, Trent escalated his tactics. He lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening growl. He told me that if I did not log in and release the digital hold within 5 minutes, he was going to call the local police. He threatened to have me arrested for corporate sabotage, cyber terrorism, and intentional destruction of company assets. He promised to ruin my professional reputation so thoroughly that I would never work in the international logistics industry again. He told me that his father, the chief executive officer, was going to sue me for every penny I owned. I waited for him to completely finish his unhinged, uneducated rant. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power of the moment coursing through my veins. I looked at Isaac, who gave me a subtle nod of encouragement, his eyes gleaming with pride. I leaned closer to the speakerphone and spoke in the calmest, most icy tone I could possibly muster. "I do not work for you, Trent," I said plainly. "You fired me. You did it in writing." There was a sudden dead silence on the other end of the line. The reality of my words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I calmly explained that I no longer had access to the servers because his own human resources department had processed my termination. I reminded him that my $1 million surety bond was legally dissolved the exact second he sent that text message to my personal phone. I told him that I was a civilian now, and that if a civilian attempted to log into a locked federal customs portal, it would be a felony. I asked him if he really wanted me to commit a federal crime on a recorded hotel phone line. Trent tried to stammer out a response, but I did not give him the chance. I told him to never contact my personal phone or my hotel room ever again. I reached out and pressed the end call button, cutting off his pathetic voice and returning the suite to a state of absolute perfect peace. I stood near the edge of the bed, staring at the heavy brass hotel phone, feeling my heart race with a mixture of disbelief and sheer adrenaline. Trent's voice was still echoing through the speakerphone, a frantic mix of panic and pure rage. Even after I told him that I did not work for him anymore, he refused to accept reality. He started screaming louder, demanding that I stop being difficult and just log in to fix the software glitch. He sounded like a desperate child throwing a tantrum because he could not get his way. He threatened to call the police again, he threatened to sue me for millions of dollars, and he threatened to ruin my entire life if I did not immediately comply with his absurd demands. I was just about to press the mute button and let him scream into the void when a calm, steady hand reached out and gently pulled the receiver away from me. Isaac had been standing right behind me the entire time, listening to every single unhinged word Trent had been shouting. Isaac is a corporate mergers and acquisitions attorney. He spends his days dismantling multi-billion-dollar companies, negotiating high-stakes legal contracts, and tearing apart aggressive executives in boardrooms. He possesses an incredible ability to remain completely ice-cold under pressure. He looked down at the speakerphone, his expression perfectly blank, but his dark eyes gleaming with absolute lethal intent. He pressed the speaker button, turning it off, so the sound of Trent's voice was no longer filling our honeymoon suite. He picked up the heavy brass receiver, held it to his ear, and waited for a brief moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Isaac spoke. His voice was incredibly smooth, deep, and completely devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used when he was about to intellectually destroy an opponent in a negotiation. "Trent, my name is Isaac, and I am Gemma's legal counsel," he said, deliberately emphasizing the word counsel. Trent immediately stopped screaming. The sudden introduction of a lawyer into the conversation seemed to short-circuit his brain. Isaac did not give him a chance to respond. He simply continued speaking, his words slow and measured like a judge delivering a sentence. "I have been listening to this entire conversation," Isaac said, leaning slightly against the wooden desk. "And I need to inform you that you are currently treading on incredibly dangerous legal ground. You just threatened a private civilian with police action for refusing to access a secure federal database. You fired my client last night at exactly 8:15. You did so via text message, and you subsequently locked her out of the corporate servers. You revoked her employee status." Trent tried to interrupt, stammering something about a misunderstanding and how I was still technically responsible for the cargo ship. Isaac cut him off immediately, his voice dropping an octave lower. "Do not interrupt me," Isaac said sharply, the absolute authority in his tone completely silencing Trent. "You terminated her employment. Because of your direct actions, her $1 million surety bond was legally dissolved. She no longer holds the legal authority to sign off on federal maritime manifests for your company." Isaac paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. He wanted Trent to fully understand the catastrophic reality of the situation. "I want to make this exceptionally clear to you, Trent." Isaac continued, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "If my client were to log into the United States Customs and Border Protection database right now, under the guise of an active employee, she would be committing a federal crime. She would be committing unauthorized access to a government system. And you, as a corporate officer, are currently attempting to coerce her into committing that felony on a recorded hotel phone line." I could practically hear the color draining from Trent's face through the phone. He had thought he could just bully his way out of this disaster by screaming and throwing his title around. He had never considered the actual legal ramifications of his actions. He was a spoiled nepotism hire who was completely out of his depth. Isaac was not finished yet. He was going to make sure Trent understood that he was completely and utterly alone in this nightmare. Furthermore, Isaac said, his tone becoming even colder, "Your attempt to bypass the Port Authority lockout at 3:15 this morning using your executive override credentials was automatically flagged by Homeland Security. Yes, we know about that. Your entire operating fleet is currently under a universal federal hold for suspected unauthorized import smuggling. Your company is hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars in maritime fines as we speak. This is not a glitch, Trent. This is the direct result of your gross negligence." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. The arrogant vice president of operations had been completely dismantled in less than 2 minutes. He had absolutely nothing left to say. He could not scream, he could not threaten, and he certainly could not demand anything anymore. Isaac had built an impenetrable legal wall around me, protecting me from any further harassment. "From this moment forward, you are instructed to cease all direct contact with my client." Isaac concluded, his voice returning to its smooth, professional cadence. "Any further communication regarding this matter must be directed entirely through my legal office. If you attempt to contact her personal phone, her email, or this hotel room ever again, I will personally file a restraining order for corporate harassment, and I will forward the recording of this phone call directly to the federal auditors currently investigating your smuggling attempt. Do you understand me?" Trent did not answer. He just breathed heavily into the receiver, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster he had created. Isaac did not wait for a confirmation. He simply reached out and pressed the button on the base of the phone, disconnecting the call with a sharp, satisfying click. He placed the heavy brass receiver back into its cradle and turned to look at me, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. I let out a long breath that I did not even realize I had been holding. I felt incredibly safe, incredibly loved, and incredibly powerful. Isaac walked over, wrapped his arms around me, and kissed my forehead. "I think it is time we ordered that breakfast," he said softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "We have a very busy day of doing absolutely nothing ahead of us." I laughed, resting my head against his chest, feeling the last lingering remnants of my corporate stress melt away. Trent was now completely isolated, trapped in a federal nightmare of his own making, and Isaac and I were finally free to enjoy the first beautiful morning of our new life together. After Isaac disconnected the hotel phone, the silence in our suite felt heavier than before. It was not a tense silence, but rather the profound quiet of a war that had just been decisively won. I sat back down on the edge of the large bed, picking up my dark cell phone from the nightstand. Since the battery had died during the chaotic storm of automated server alerts and Trent's relentless calls, I reached into my travel bag and plugged the device into the charger. A few moments later, the screen glowed to life, displaying the familiar startup logo. I expected to see a massive wall of missed calls from Trent, but as the notifications began to populate, I saw a different name dominating the screen. It was Richard. Richard is the chief executive officer of the company and Trent's father. He is a 60-year-old man who built his logistics empire from the ground up, but his one fatal blind spot had always been his arrogant son. My phone showed 15 new voicemails, all from Richard, left over the course of the past 2 hours, while Isaac and I were peacefully sleeping. I tapped the screen to open the voicemail application and put the phone on speaker so Isaac could listen. The first voicemail was time-stamped at 6 in the morning. Richard's voice sounded gruff and deeply annoyed. He did not sound like a man who realized his company was collapsing. He sounded like a boss who was irritated by an administrative error. "Gemma, this is Richard," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "Trent just woke me up claiming that you locked yourself out of the compliance network and are refusing to answer your phone. I do not care if you are on your honeymoon, you need to log in and release the Long Beach cargo. Call me back immediately." The first message ended with a sharp click. Isaac shook his head, taking another sip of his coffee. Trent lied to him. Isaac noted accurately. "He tried to frame you for the delay." I tapped the screen to play the next message, which was left 30 minutes later. The annoyance in Richard's voice had completely vanished, replaced by genuine confusion and the first subtle hints of panic. "Gemma, it is Richard again," he said, his breathing noticeably faster. "I just spoke with the Human Resources Director. She told me that Trent processed a formal termination under your name last night. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me my son did not just cancel our $1 million surety bond while we have $50 million sitting in international waters. Please call me back." I let the voicemails play in chronological order, watching as the proud chief executive officer slowly spiraled into absolute despair. By 7 in the morning, the situation at the port had clearly escalated beyond a simple delay. The seventh voicemail was frantic. "Gemma, pick up the phone," Richard pleaded, the background noise indicating he was pacing rapidly across a hard floor. "The terminal manager at Long Beach just called my personal cell phone. He said our ship is locked out and the gates are secured. My board of directors is waking up to emergency alerts from the financial department because the delay fines are accumulating at a catastrophic rate. Trent is not answering my calls anymore. What did he do? What exactly did my son do to you?" Isaac reached out and rested his hand on my knee, silently acknowledging the incredible weight of the situation. Richard was finally waking up to the reality that his son was not just incompetent, but actively destructive. The 10th voicemail, time stamped at 7:30, was where the true devastation of the night finally caught up to the top of the corporate ladder. Richard's voice was shaking, completely devoid of its usual commanding presence. "Gemma, I just got off the phone with our legal team." Richard stammered his words, stumbling over one another. "Homeland Security just placed a universal federal hold on our entire operating fleet. Every single ship, every single truck, every single warehouse is locked down. They are telling me that an unauthorized user attempted to force the Long Beach cargo through the federal gates using an executive override. They are treating us like an active smuggling operation. The board of directors has called an emergency session for this afternoon, and they are already threatening a unanimous vote of no confidence to remove me as chief executive officer. I am losing everything. My son has gone completely rogue, and he is going to bankrupt the company I spent 30 years building. The message cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy, chilling atmosphere in our hotel room. The man who had enabled Trent's toxic behavior for years was now watching his entire legacy burn to the ground because of it. The final voicemail was left just 15 minutes before Trent had called our hotel room. It was not an order or a demand. It was the sound of a broken man begging for mercy. "Gemma, please." Richard whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know what he did to you. I saw the text message he sent. It was cruel, and it was unforgivable. I will double your salary. I will give you an equity stake in the company. I will give you anything you want if you just log in and verify that cargo. Please save my company." The recording stopped and the automated system announced that there were no more messages. I looked at Isaac, who simply raised an eyebrow. Richard was desperate enough to promise the world, but he still did not understand the fundamental truth. The company was no longer his to save. I turned off the phone and set it back on the nightstand. There was absolutely no amount of money that could convince me to return. We decided to get dressed and head down to the hotel lobby for breakfast. Isaac and I took our time getting dressed for the post-wedding family brunch. We chose comfortable, elegant clothes, completely unbothered by the corporate apocalypse happening across the city. When we rode the elevator down to the main hotel lobby, the atmosphere was incredibly warm and inviting. The hotel had reserved a beautiful private dining area for our family, filled with morning sunlight and the smell of freshly roasted coffee. Both of our families were already there, laughing and sharing stories from the wedding reception the night before. Isaac's parents were chatting happily with my relatives, and the entire room felt like a perfect extension of our wedding day. I sat down next to Isaac, pouring myself a glass of fresh orange juice and taking a deep breath of perfect contentment. I was surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected me. It was the exact opposite of the toxic environment I had endured for so many years under Trent and his father. I felt completely detached from the logistics company and the cargo ship. We spent the first hour of the brunch simply enjoying the food and the company. Nobody at the table knew about the midnight drama or the frantic voicemails I had received that morning. As far as our families were concerned, Isaac and I were just two happy newlyweds preparing to leave for our honeymoon. The contrast between the peace in that dining room and the absolute chaos unfolding at the corporate headquarters was deeply satisfying. That feeling of perfect peace was abruptly shattered just before 10 o'clock. I was in the middle of laughing at a joke Isaac's father was telling when the heavy glass doors of the private dining room were suddenly pushed open. The joyous chatter instantly died down as two men walked in, uninvited. It was Richard and his son Trent. The sight of them standing there in the doorway was genuinely shocking. Richard usually carried himself with the untouchable arrogance of a chief executive officer, but today he looked completely disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face was flushed a deep, angry red. But Trent was the one who truly looked like a broken man. The arrogant vice president of operations who had fired me via text message just hours ago was now sweating profusely. His skin was pale and his eyes were darting nervously around the room. He looked physically ill, terrified by the consequences of his own actions. They stood in the doorway, scanning the room until Richard's eyes locked onto me. He did not hesitate. He marched straight across the room toward our table, ignoring confused stares of our family. Trent trailed closely behind him, looking like a scolded child. Isaac instantly shifted in his seat, placing himself slightly in front of me as a physical barrier between me and my former employers. The room went dead silent as Richard stopped right in front of our table. He tried to force a polite smile, but it looked like a desperate grimace. "Gemma, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice tight with suppressed panic. He did not say hello or apologize for interrupting our family gathering. He simply demanded my attention. Before I could even respond, Richard launched into a frantic gaslighting campaign. He looked around the room and tried to play the role of the benevolent father figure. He told me that we were all just one big corporate family and that families sometimes have little misunderstandings. He actually used the word misunderstanding to describe his son firing me, locking me out of the servers, and triggering a massive federal investigation. He spoke quickly, waving his hands, trying to downplay the situation. He said that Trent had simply made a minor administrative error while updating the human resources database. It was such a blatant, ridiculous lie that I laughed. Richard then turned to his son and grabbed him roughly by the shoulder, pushing him forward. He ordered Trent to apologize to me. Trent looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. He mumbled a pathetic apology, saying that he was sorry for the confusion and never meant to terminate my employment. He sounded like a teenager being forced to apologize. It was the weakest cowardly display I had ever witnessed from a man who loved to project absolute dominance. Richard nodded eagerly, acting as if that mumbled sentence completely erased the federal lockdown currently paralyzing his entire network. With the forced apology out of the way, Richard immediately transitioned to his true objective. He leaned over the table, invading our personal space, and lowered his voice. He told me that the federal holds at the port were causing a slight logistical headache and that he needed me to log into my laptop right there in the lobby to clear the automated flags. He spoke as if he was asking me to do a simple favor. Then came the ultimate insult. Richard pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and slid it across the white tablecloth toward me. It was a new employment contract. He told me that he was willing to forget about my lack of communication that morning and offer my job back. He proudly announced that he had included a $5,000 signing bonus as a gesture of his goodwill. He genuinely believed that a minor bonus and a fake apology would make me forget years of disrespect and instantly fix the monumental federal disaster his son had created. He thought he could buy his way out of a Homeland Security investigation for $5,000. I looked down at the piece of paper resting next to my coffee cup, and then I looked up into Richard's desperate, sweating face. He had no idea that he was no longer holding any of the cards. He was standing in a room full of my family, offering me pennies to save an empire that was already burning down. Richard stood there, leaning over our table with his desperate, sweaty face, expecting me to eagerly snatch up his pathetic employment contract. He genuinely believed that offering a $5,000 bonus would magically erase the catastrophic federal lockdown his son had caused. The entire private dining room was perfectly still. My family and Isaac's family were watching this bizarre corporate intrusion with a mixture of profound confusion and growing anger. My mother clutched her coffee cup nervously, while Isaac's father sat rigid and protective. But before I could even push the piece of paper back across the white tablecloth, a new voice entered the conversation. It was a voice that commanded absolute, immediate respect. Simone, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table enjoying her avocado toast, slowly wiped her mouth with a linen napkin. She placed her ceramic coffee cup down on its saucer with a sharp, deliberate clink that echoed through the silent room. She stood up smoothly, her posture impeccably straight, and walked around the table until she was standing directly next to Isaac and me. Richard looked at her with mild annoyance, clearly thinking she was just a protective bridesmaid or a concerned sister trying to intervene in a private business matter. He opened his mouth to dismiss her, but Simone was already reaching into her designer leather handbag. She pulled out a sleek black leather wallet and flipped it open. Inside, pinned to the leather, was a heavy, gleaming silver badge bearing the official seal of the United States government. Directly below the badge was her federal identification card. Simone held it up so the morning sunlight caught the metal, making it impossible for Richard to ignore. "Richard," she said, her voice perfectly level, but carrying the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "My name is Simone, and I believe we have a mutual professional interest. I am a senior auditor for the United States Customs and Border Protection." Richard froze completely. The arrogant dismissal he was about to voice died in his throat. His eyes darted from the federal badge to Simone's calm, confident face and back to the badge again. Trent, who was still standing slightly behind his father, let out a soft, pathetic gasp. He recognized the agency name immediately. Simone did not break eye contact with Richard. She let the reality of her identity sink in before she continued. She explained that she was the specific federal agent assigned to monitor his corporate logistics network, and that she had been actively tracking his son's unauthorized activities for the past 4 months. She told him that she was the one who personally authorized the watch order on the $50 million shipment currently sitting in the Pacific Ocean. Richard started to stammer, his face losing whatever little color it had left. He tried to fall back on his gaslighting strategy, attempting to use his polished corporate charm on a federal agent. He nervously told Simone that this was all just a massive misunderstanding and an internal human resources issue that was currently being resolved. He gestured toward the contract sitting on the table, claiming that he was rehiring his chief compliance officer right now and that the digital flags would be cleared in a matter of minutes. Isaac let out a low, humorless laugh at the sheer audacity of the man. Simone smiled, but it was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes. She closed her leather wallet and slipped it back into her handbag. "This is no longer an internal human resources issue, Richard," she stated, her voice slicing through his pathetic lies. "You do not get to fire a licensed compliance officer, sever $1 million surety bond, and then pretend it was just a paperwork error. The second your son processed that termination, your company lost its legal authorization to import restricted goods, and if he had simply stopped there, this would just be a very expensive administrative delay. But your son did not stop there." Simone turned her piercing gaze toward Trent, who practically shrank under her intense scrutiny. She addressed Trent directly, her voice echoing clearly across the dining room. "At exactly 3:15 this morning you logged into the senior management gateway," Simone said, recounting the exact digital footprint she had monitored from her hotel room. "You attempted to use your executive override credentials to bypass the automated federal lockout at the Long Beach port." Trent looked like he was about to faint. He had no idea that a federal auditor had watched him commit a crime in real time. Simone turned back to Richard, who looked as though the floor was opening up beneath him. "When your unlicensed son attempted to force a locked shipment of restricted goods across a national border without a valid surety bond, he escalated this from a corporate mistake to a federal crime. That was an act of unauthorized import smuggling. I personally placed a universal federal hold on your entire operating fleet. Every ship, every truck, every warehouse is now an active crime scene." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His shoulders slumped forward in total defeat. Simone was not finished delivering the devastating news. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the edge of the table. "You are standing here trying to bribe my sister-in-law with a $5,000 bonus," she said, her tone dripping with professional disdain. "I think you should know that, because of the active smuggling investigation, the maritime delay penalties are currently compounding at a rate of $100,000 per hour. And those fines began accumulating the exact second the port gates locked at midnight. By the time this brunch is over, your son will have cost your company over $1 million in non-negotiable federal fines, and there is absolutely no employment contract on this table that can make those fines disappear." The silence in the private dining room was absolutely suffocating after Simone delivered her devastating news. Trent stood frozen behind his father, his face completely drained of color. He had just been told by a federal agent that his actions were causing his company to lose $100,000 every single hour. Everyone at the brunch table was staring at him with a mixture of disgust and sheer disbelief. For a man whose entire personality was built on unearned corporate superiority, being publicly humiliated in front of 2 families was the ultimate nightmare. I watched his hands begin to shake. He looked at his father, seeking some kind of protection, but Richard was staring blankly at the table, completely broken by the reality of the federal smuggling investigation. Trent realized in that moment that his father could not save him. He was completely cornered. But instead of accepting defeat, Trent's toxic ego took over. His mind desperately searched for any possible way to regain control of the situation. He needed to inflict pain. He needed to prove that he still held some kind of power over my life. I saw his eyes dart toward our luxurious luggage neatly stacked near the entrance of the dining room, waiting to be taken to the airport. A sudden malicious spark lit up his face. Trent slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were still trembling, but a sickeningly arrogant smile began to creep across his face. He remembered something that I had honestly forgotten in the midst of the federal chaos. 3 months ago, as a reward for saving the company millions of dollars in compliance audits, the board of directors had awarded me a fully paid luxury honeymoon. Because it was a corporate bonus, the flights and the hotel accommodations were booked directly through the company executive travel portal. The tickets were tied to the corporate account. Trent stared down at his phone screen, his thumbs moving rapidly. He was logging into the administrative side of the travel network, right there in the middle of the dining room. He was completely ignoring the fact that a federal agent was standing just a few feet away. In his twisted mind, he believed that if he could take away the most important vacation of my life, he would suddenly have the ultimate leverage. He thought he could hold my honeymoon hostage. He navigated to my specific itinerary, and with a few swift taps, he maliciously canceled the entire trip. He canceled the luxury flights. He canceled the beachfront resort. He completely erased the corporate bonus that I had rightfully earned. Trent locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He took a step out from behind his father and looked directly at me. The terror that had been paralyzing him just moments before was entirely gone, replaced by a smug, victorious sneer. He puffed out his chest and spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you have won, Gemma," he said, completely ignoring Simone and Isaac. "You think you can just sit here eating brunch while my company bleeds money? Well, I just logged into the travel portal. I just canceled your first-class flights, and I canceled your luxury hotel reservation. The entire trip is gone." My family gasped in shock. My mother dropped her hands to her lap, completely horrified by the sheer cruelty of the act. Trent ignored them, basking in what he thought was a moment of absolute triumph. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table right next to the rejected employment contract. "If you want to go on your little honeymoon," he threatened, "you are going to open your laptop right now, log into the federal database, and release my cargo ship. If you do that, I will consider rebooking your flights. If you refuse, you can spend your wedding night sitting in the airport lobby." He smiled a wide, terrifyingly empty smile. For a brief second, the room was completely silent. And then Isaac began to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh or a polite chuckle. It was a deep, genuine, booming laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the private dining room. Isaac threw his head back, completely amused by the absolute absurdity of Trent's petty threat. Trent's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by total confusion. He looked at Isaac like he had lost his mind. Richard finally snapped out of his state of shock and looked at his son with pure, unadulterated horror, realizing that Trent had just poured gasoline on a burning bridge. Isaac slowly stopped laughing and wiped a small tear of amusement from his eye. He looked at Trent, shaking his head in absolute pity. "Trent, you really are the most predictable man I have ever met," Isaac said, his voice smooth and incredibly relaxed. "Did you honestly think I would let my wife depend on a corporate travel portal controlled by a man who throws temper tantrums? Did you really think I would leave our honeymoon in your incompetent hands?" 2 weeks ago, Isaac explained to the entire room I personally called the airline and the resort. I canceled the corporate reservations myself. I rebooked everything using my own private accounts. We are flying first class on a completely different airline, and we are staying in a private oceanfront villa in the Maldives. Your little cancellation button did absolutely nothing. Trent stared at Isaac, his mouth hanging slightly open. The realization that his final desperate attack had been completely neutralized hit him incredibly hard. He had humiliated himself in front of two families for absolutely no reason. But Isaac, the brilliant corporate attorney, was not quite finished. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. He bypassed Trent entirely and slid the envelope across the table until it rested directly in front of Richard. Isaac looked at the chief executive officer, his eyes dark and completely serious. That honeymoon was not a gift, Isaac stated firmly. It was a documented performance bonus, formally awarded by your board of directors. It is legally classified as earned compensation. By maliciously canceling it, your son just committed retaliatory wage theft against a former employee. Inside that envelope is a drafted lawsuit ready to be filed in civil court tomorrow morning. Not only will you be paying for the original trip, but you will be paying punitive damages for extreme emotional distress. Isaac stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and offered me his hand. The brunch was officially over. We had utterly destroyed them. I took my husband's hand, feeling incredibly powerful as we prepared to leave the broken executive sitting at our table. Richard stared at the crisp white envelope containing the drafted lawsuit that Isaac had just placed on the table. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on the chief executive officer. His son had not just made a simple human resources error. Trent had committed a federal crime, committed retaliatory wage theft, and publicly humiliated the family of a highly specialized corporate lawyer. The brunch table was completely silent except for the soft clinking of silverware from the main restaurant outside our private room. Richard looked up from the envelope and turned his eyes back to me. All of the corporate arrogance was completely gone from his face. He looked 10 years older than he had when he walked into the room. He reached out with trembling hands and slowly pushed the employment contract back toward me. He was no longer demanding or ordering. He was begging. "Gemma, please," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "I will pay the lawsuit. I will pay for the new honeymoon. I will give you whatever salary you want, but I am begging you to sign this contract. You built our compliance network. You know the software better than anyone else in the world. Just sign the paper, open your laptop, and release the software lock. If the federal holds stay active for another 24 hours, the board of directors will liquidate the company. Please." I looked at the desperate man standing before me. For years I had watched Richard ruthlessly crush his competitors and terminate loyal employees without a single second of hesitation. Now he was practically on his knees asking a 33-year-old woman to save his legacy from his own son's incompetence. I glanced at Isaac, who gave me a slow, confirming nod. It was time to deliver the final fatal blow. It was time to reveal the secret that Isaac and I had carefully built into my initial employment contract 5 years ago. I did not reach for the pen. I did not look at the contract. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee, placed the cup gently on the saucer, and looked Richard directly in the eyes. "Richard, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about my relationship with your corporate software," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "You just said that I know the software better than anyone else in the world. That is true, but it is not because I am just a very good chief compliance officer. It is because I am the person who wrote the algorithm it runs on." Richard frowned, clearly confused by my statement. He knew I had implemented the new automated system when I was hired, but he had never bothered to understand the technical details of how it actually worked. Trent, who was still standing paralyzed in the background, looked equally confused. I decided to spell it out for them in the simplest terms possible. 5 years ago, when you hired me, your company was facing millions of dollars in federal fines because your compliance department was using outdated manual entry methods, I explained. I told you that I could automate your entire customs clearance process. I built a proprietary algorithm that links directly to the United States Customs and Border Protection database. It is the software that your entire global logistics network relies on to clear cargo through international ports. Richard nodded slowly, still not grasping the true gravity of the situation. "Yes, and you did a wonderful job, Gemma," he pleaded. "That is why we need you back. We need you to operate your system." I smiled a cold, brilliant smile. "You do not understand, Richard," I said softly. "I do not just operate the system, I own it." The silence in the room deepened. I turned to Isaac, who reached into his sleek leather briefcase resting beside his chair. He pulled out a thick, bound legal document and placed it on the table right next to his drafted lawsuit. This was not a standard employment agreement. This was the original contract Isaac had negotiated for me when I first joined the company. Isaac tapped the heavy document with his index finger. My wife holds the exclusive intellectual property rights and the registered patent for the compliance algorithm your company uses. Isaac stated, his voice echoing with absolute legal authority. When she agreed to work for you, she did not sell you the software. She granted the company a provisional license to use her proprietary technology. And if you look at Section 4, Paragraph 2 of this original contract, you will see a very specific licensing clause. Isaac paused, letting the suspense hang in the air before delivering the ultimate checkmate. The contract clearly states that the corporate license to utilize the algorithm is strictly contingent upon Gemma's active employment status. Richard's eyes widened in absolute horror as the pieces finally clicked together in his mind. He looked down at the bound document and then slowly turned his head to look at his sweating, trembling son. Trent's jaw had practically dropped to the floor. When Trent processed my termination last night, he did not just fire an employee, I continued driving the final nail into the coffin. He did not just sever my $1 million surety bond. The exact second he clicked terminate in the human resources database, he legally revoked your company's license to use my software. The system did not glitch, Richard. It completely shut down because you no longer have the legal right to run my algorithm on your servers. When Trent sent me that text message saying, "Consider it my gift to you," he literally stripped your company of its entire operational infrastructure. You are completely paralyzed not because of a missing signature, but because your son threw away the engine that makes your ships move. Richard gasped loudly, suddenly clutching the hard edge of the dining table. He was now completely and utterly destroyed beyond repair. The shock in the private dining room was palpable. Richard stared at the legal contract Isaac had provided, realizing that his entire logistics empire was now completely paralyzed because his son had illegally revoked my software license. Before Richard could formulate a coherent sentence, his cell phone began vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, and his face turned a pale shade of white. It was an automated alert. The board of directors had initiated the emergency virtual meeting to discuss the federal lockdown. Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with a level of desperation I had never seen before. He begged me to walk with him to the hotel business center and join the video call. He pleaded with me to explain the software licensing issue to the board and help him buy some time. I looked at Isaac, who gave me a subtle nod of approval. I told Richard that I would attend the meeting, but I made one thing absolutely clear. I would not attend as his employee. I would only join the call under the official title of an independent third-party consultant. Richard eagerly agreed to my terms, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. We left the private dining room, leaving our families to finish brunch in peace. Isaac walked closely by my side, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. Richard practically sprinted through the elegant hotel lobby while Trent dragged his feet, looking like a man walking to the gallows. The hotel business center was a quiet space with frosted glass walls and a mahogany table. Richard quickly sat down at the head of the table and opened his laptop, connecting to the corporate virtual meeting room. Trent sat as far away from the camera as possible, trying to hide in the background. I took a seat right next to Richard, with Isaac standing firmly behind my chair. As the video conferencing software loaded, I could see the faces of the 12 board members appearing on the screen. These were ruthless veteran investors who cared only about profit margins and corporate stability. They did not care about family ties or nepotism. They only cared that a $50 million cargo ship was currently locked out of the port and that the company was bleeding $100,000 every single hour in federal fines. The moment the audio connected, the room was filled with the angry voices of the board members. The chairman of the board, an intimidating man with silver hair, immediately demanded answers. He wanted to know why Homeland Security had placed a universal hold on their entire operating fleet, and why the proprietary compliance software was suddenly completely inaccessible. Richard tried to speak, trying to use his polished corporate vocabulary to minimize the disaster. He stammered about an administrative miscommunication and an unexpected software technicality, trying to protect Trent by hiding the truth. The board members were not buying his weak excuses. They demanded to know exactly who was responsible for the federal breach. I decided that Richard had done enough talking. I leaned toward the microphone and formally introduced myself. I stated my name and clarified my new role as an independent third-party consultant. I informed the board that I was the legal owner of the compliance algorithm and that the company license had been officially revoked the previous night. The board members went completely silent, shocked to see me sitting there, and even more shocked to learn that they no longer owned the software that ran their entire company. The chairman asked me directly why the license had been revoked without any prior warning or board approval. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. I simply asked Richard for permission to share my screen with the virtual meeting. Richard, hesitant and sweating profusely, clicked the button to grant me presentation access. I connected my phone to the laptop and pulled up my personal text messages. I mirrored my screen directly into the video conference displaying the exact conversation from the night before. I made sure the text was large enough for every single board member to read clearly. There, in bright bold letters, was the message from the Vice President of Operations. You are fired. Consider it my gift to you. I am locking you out of the company servers right now. I let the image sit there on the screen for a long, agonizing moment. I explained to the board that because Trent had officially terminated my employment via text message during my wedding reception, he had legally triggered the clause that dissolved the surety bond and revoked the software license. The board reaction was immediate and explosive. The absolute silence on the call was shattered by a volcanic eruption of outrage. The chairman slammed his hand on his desk, completely losing his professional composure. He screamed at Richard, demanding to know why a 28-year-old nepotism hire was allowed to terminate the chief compliance officer without board approval. Another board member shouted that Trent's unchecked ego had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar federal contract. The investors were furious, realizing that they were losing massive amounts of money simply because the chief executive officer wanted to play favorites with his incompetent son. They directed their pure, unadulterated rage at Trent, who was visibly shaking in his chair at the back of the business center. They called him a liability, a disaster, and a complete fool. Richard tried to defend his son, trying to explain that Trent was just stressed and made a poor judgment call, but the board absolutely refused to listen. The chairman explicitly stated that Trent's petty, childish text message was the single most expensive mistake in the history of their corporation. The illusion of Trent's corporate superiority was completely shattered live on camera. He was no longer the powerful vice president. He was just a reckless boy who had broken his father's expensive toy, and the board of directors was ready to make him pay for every single piece. The sheer panic radiating through the virtual meeting room was incredibly satisfying to witness. The board of directors had spent the last 10 minutes completely eviscerating Trent for his monumental stupidity and tearing into Richard for allowing his nepotism to jeopardize their multi-million-dollar investments. But anger was not going to unlock the port gates in Long Beach. Eventually, the shouting subsided, and the 12 faces on the screen turned their collective attention toward me. The chairman of the board leaned close to his webcam, his expression shifting from pure rage to desperate diplomacy. He addressed me with a level of respect that I had never received during my 5 years as an employee. He formally apologized on behalf of the entire corporation for the unacceptable behavior of the vice president of operations. He practically begged me to name my price. He offered to double my previous salary, triple my vacation time, and guarantee me a seat on the executive committee if I would just log into the system and reactivate the compliance license. Beside me, Richard looked up with a tiny glimmer of hope in his eyes, thinking that the massive amount of money being offered would be enough to tempt me back into his toxic corporate family. I looked at the chairman and shook my head slowly. I thanked him for his very generous offer, but I clearly stated that under absolutely no circumstances would I ever return to work for their company. I explained that trust is the foundation of any working relationship, and Trent had completely shattered that foundation when he fired me on my wedding day. I told them that I was no longer interested in being an employee who could be dismissed on a whim by an incompetent executive. The collective groan from the board members was audible through the computer speakers. They knew that without me, they could not legally access the proprietary algorithm required to clear their international shipments. They were trapped. The chairman rubbed his temples, looking like a man who was about to lose everything. He asked me what it would take to acquire the licensing rights to the software independently of my employment. He wanted to buy the algorithm outright to save the bleeding corporation. That was exactly the question we had been waiting for. I did not answer him. Instead, I simply leaned back in my comfortable leather chair and allowed my brilliant husband to step fully into the frame of the webcam. Up until that exact moment, the board had assumed Isaac was just my supportive husband, standing quietly in the background, holding my hand. But as he leaned forward, placing his hands firmly on the mahogany table, his entire demeanor shifted into the ruthless corporate attorney that made him an absolute legend in the mergers and acquisitions world. He formally introduced himself to the board of directors, providing his full name and the name of his highly prestigious law firm. The reaction from the board was immediate and profound. Several of the older wealthy investors physically recoiled, recognizing the name of a man who was famous for dismantling massive corporate entities and winning astronomical financial settlements. Isaac did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. He informed the board that his client was willing to sell the exclusive rights to the compliance software, but the terms of the surrender were going to be steep, completely non-negotiable, and effective immediately. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a digital tablet, instantly sharing a new document onto the virtual meeting screen. It was a comprehensive severance and licensing agreement that he had meticulously drafted that very morning. Isaac began to read the terms aloud, his voice incredibly smooth and uncompromising. First, he addressed the software patent itself. He stated that the company would not be leasing the algorithm anymore because they had proven themselves to be unreliable partners. They were going to buy it outright. However, because this was an emergency acquisition caused by the gross negligence of their own executive, the purchase price was set at exactly 5 times the current estimated market value of the software. Several board members gasped loudly at the staggering figure, but Isaac did not even pause to let them complain or negotiate. He simply reminded them that the Long Beach delay penalties were actively costing them $100,000 every single hour, and that paying a massive premium for the software was significantly cheaper than allowing the entire company to go totally bankrupt by tomorrow morning. The chairman closed his eyes and nodded silently, conceding the first point. He knew Isaac had them completely cornered without any legal recourse. But Isaac was just getting started with the financial takeover. Next, Isaac moved to the issue of compensation for the weekend. He informed the board that because Richard had repeatedly contacted my personal phone demanding my services, I was legally acting as an independent contractor during those hours. He demanded retroactive consulting fees calculated at an exorbitant emergency rate of $2,000 an hour. He clearly noted that this massive fee was completely separate from the wage theft lawsuit he was filing against Trent. Finally, Isaac arrived at the most critical clause of the legal document. He demanded an ironclad irrevocable waiver releasing me from any and all non-compete clauses from my previous employment contract. He stated I must be legally permitted to launch my own compliance consulting firm immediately and have the unrestricted right to solicit their biggest competitors. Richard protested weakly, claiming that giving me the right to work for their rivals would destroy their market advantage. Isaac looked directly into the camera and coldly informed the chief executive officer that his market advantage was already destroyed the moment his son sent that text message. They either signed the agreement exactly as it was written, or we would close the laptop and let the federal government dismantle their entire logistics empire. The virtual meeting room was thick with a heavy, anxious energy. Isaac had just outlined the brutal financial terms of the severance and licensing agreement. The board of directors looking through their computer screens were visibly frustrated by the massive price tag, but they were also pragmatists. They knew that paying 5 times the market value for my compliance algorithm was the only logical way to stop the bleeding. The delay penalties at the Long Beach port were continuing to climb, and the federal government was not going to wait for them to negotiate. The chairman of the board let out a long, exhausted sigh and nodded his head. He looked at Richard and verbally agreed to the financial demands. I could actually see the physical relief wash over Richard's face. His shoulders dropped and he let out a shaky breath. He genuinely thought the worst was over. He believed that he could just write a massive check, apologize to his investors, and go back to his comfortable life as the chief executive officer. He even reached out a hand to pat Trent on the back as if to say they had survived the storm. But Isaac was not finished. He remained standing behind my chair, his expression completely unreadable. He slowly scrolled to the final page of the digital document he had shared on the screen. The financial compensation was only the first half of the agreement, Isaac said, his deep voice cutting through the momentary relief in the room. There is one final clause. This clause is absolute and completely non-negotiable. If it is not executed immediately, my client walks away and your company burns to the ground today. The silence in the hotel business center returned instantly. Richard pulled his hand away from his son and stared at the screen, a new wave of panic washing over his face. Isaac did not hesitate. He looked directly into the camera, ensuring every single board member was listening closely. Clause 4, Section A. Isaac read aloud, his voice echoing with cold precision. Effective immediately, the current Vice President of Operations must be terminated from his position. This termination will be classified as a dismissal for gross negligence. Furthermore, he will be immediately stripped of all unvested corporate shares, and he will be permanently banned from entering any property owned or operated by this corporation. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Trent, who had been hiding in the background, suddenly jumped out of his chair. His face was flushed with pure panic and outrage. He looked at his father, his eyes wide with terror. "Dad, you cannot let them do this," Trent stammered, his voice cracking. "I am your son. You built this company for me. Tell them no. Tell them we will find another way." But there was no other way, and everyone in that room knew it. The board of directors erupted into a chorus of immediate agreement. The chairman leaned forward, his face hardened with resolve. He looked directly at Richard and told him that this was the most reasonable demand Isaac had made all day. The investors had just lost millions of dollars because of Trent's arrogance, and they wanted blood. They demanded that Richard sign the document and execute the termination right there on the camera. Richard was completely frozen. He was trapped in the ultimate nightmare for any parent who had blindly protected their child. He looked at the computer screen, seeing the angry, unforgiving faces of the men and women who controlled his corporate destiny. Then he turned to look at Trent. For the first time in his life, Richard was forced to truly see his son, not as the heir to his empire, but as the reckless, entitled liability he had actually become. Richard had spent 28 years shielding Trent from the consequences of his actions. He had given him expensive cars, prestigious job titles, and endless second chances. And this was the result. His son had pushed the company to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy just to prove a petty point to a female employee. Trent's panic turned into a pathetic display of begging. He grabbed his father's arm, pleading with him to fight back. He promised he would learn the logistics systems. He promised he would go to corporate training. He promised he would never make a mistake again. But his promises were entirely empty. They both knew that Trent had absolutely no idea how to run a supply chain network. He was a fraud, and the entire world had just watched his mask slip. Richard slowly pulled his arm away from his son's grasp. His face was a portrait of pure devastation. He was an older man who suddenly realized that his entire life work was slipping through his fingers. He had to make an impossible choice. He could refuse to sign the contract protecting his son from humiliation, but condemning his massive logistics company and thousands of innocent employees to absolute financial ruin. Or he could sign the document saving his legacy, but publicly destroying his own flesh and blood. Isaac tapped his watch, looking down at Richard with eyes devoid of any sympathy. "You have exactly 2 minutes to decide," Isaac stated firmly. The federal fines are continuing to accumulate, and my wife and I have a honeymoon flight to catch. We are not going to sit here and watch you debate your parenting failures. Sign the document, Richard. Save your company or watch it die with your son. I sat quietly watching the emotional climax unfold. I did not feel bad for Richard, and I certainly did not feel bad for Trent. I had spent years being marginalized, disrespected, and overworked by these two men. They had tried to ruin the happiest day of my life. Now the power dynamic had completely shifted. Richard looked at me, his eyes begging for some kind of mercy, some kind of alternative. I offered him nothing but a blank, calm stare. The clock was ticking. The board members were shouting for him to sign. Trent was crying quietly in the corner of the room. The great chief executive officer was backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to run. He reached a trembling hand toward his laptop keyboard, positioning his finger over the digital signature pad. The weight of his entire world was resting on that single choice. Trent could see his father's finger hovering over the signature pad on the laptop keyboard. The reality finally broke through his wall of delusion, and he completely lost his mind. He lunged forward, grabbing his father's arm and pulling his hand away from the computer. "Dad, you cannot do this!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "You cannot let these people come in here and dictate the terms of our family business. I am your son. You cannot fire me for a stupid computer glitch." He pointed a shaking finger at Isaac and me, his face contorted with anger. "They are trying to steal from us. They are trying to ruin me because she is jealous of my promotion. Do not give them the company. Just call the authorities and tell them she is holding the software hostage." Trent was completely unhinged, ranting about conspiracies and refusing to accept that he was the sole cause of the disaster. Through the computer speakers, I could hear the board of directors groaning in absolute disgust at his childish behavior. Richard slowly pulled his arm out of his son's frantic grip. He turned his chair slightly so he was facing Trent directly. For a long, silent moment, Richard just looked at his son. He did not yell back. He did not try to comfort him. He stared at him with a look of profound, heartbreaking realization. For 28 years, Richard had been wearing a blindfold. He had convinced himself that Trent was just a little rough around the edges, that he just needed more time to mature into a corporate leader. He had ignored the complaints from human resources and allowed his son to treat hardworking employees like garbage, all in the name of family loyalty. But sitting in that hotel business center, watching his son scream instead of taking responsibility, Richard finally saw the truth. Trent was not a leader. He was an entitled, arrogant boy who had never been told no in his entire life. Because Richard had never told him no, the company was losing $100,000 an hour and facing total collapse. The blindfold was completely gone. Richard looked from his son to the laptop screen, where the angry faces of his board members were waiting. He knew if he tried to protect Trent one more time, the board would remove him as chief executive officer. Richard turned back to the computer. He placed his finger on the trackpad, moved the cursor to the bottom of the severance agreement, and officially signed the document. The digital ink locked into place, sealing the financial takeover and the transfer of the software patent. Isaac immediately received a confirmation email, ensuring the contract was legally binding. Richard took a deep breath, sitting up straight, attempting to gather whatever shred of dignity he had left. He looked directly into the webcam, addressing the 12 silent investors. "The agreement is signed," Richard stated, his voice heavy with defeat. "The software license is officially acquired." He then turned his head slowly to look at Trent, who was standing completely still, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Trent," Richard said, his voice devoid of parental warmth. "Effective immediately, your employment with this corporation is permanently terminated. You are being dismissed for gross negligence and severe misconduct. You are stripped of all unvested shares, and you are no longer authorized to act on behalf of this company." The words hit Trent like a physical blow. He staggered backward, clutching the edge of the mahogany table. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His father had just fired him on a live video feed. Before Trent could recover from the shock and start screaming again, the frosted glass doors of the business center swung open. Two large hotel security guards stepped into the room, their expressions incredibly serious. Isaac casually checked his watch. He had anticipated this exact scenario. While Richard and Trent were crashing our family brunch, Isaac had quietly stepped aside and spoken to the hotel management. He informed them that a terminated employee might cause a severe disturbance and arranged for security to be waiting down the hall. The timing was absolutely flawless. The security guards walked directly toward Trent, asking him to please keep his voice down and gather his belongings. Trent looked at the guards and then looked back at his father, his face turning purple with rage. "You called security on me," he screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are throwing me out like I am nothing. I am your son." Richard did not look at him. He stared down at his hands resting on the table, completely unable to meet Trent's eyes. The board of directors watched the entire scene unfold, witnessing the absolute destruction of the nepotism that plagued their company for years. The security guards did not give Trent time to argue. They moved in quickly, taking him firmly by the arms. Trent tried to pull away, digging his expensive shoes into the carpet, but he was completely overpowered. They began walking him toward the doors, and Trent completely lost his mind. He screamed obscenities at his father, at the board, and at me, blaming everyone else for his failures. He sounded like an absolute madman. As the guards dragged him through the glass doors and out into the hotel corridor, his voice faded away, leaving a stunned silence in the business center. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not feel any pity for him. I had endured his condescension and cruelty for years, and watching him finally face the natural consequences of his actions was the most deeply satisfying moment of my professional career. The toxic prince of the logistics empire had been completely dethroned, stripped of his power, and literally dragged out of the building. I looked over at Isaac, who gave me a warm, proud smile. We won. After the incredibly satisfying conclusion in the hotel business center, Isaac and I did exactly what we set out to do. We collected our luxury luggage, said goodbye to our families, and headed straight to the airport for our actual honeymoon. Sitting in the first-class lounge waiting for our flight to the Maldives, I opened my laptop one last time. A deal is a deal, and unlike my former employers, I actually honor my legally binding contracts. The wire transfer for the software patent had already cleared, hitting my bank account with a number so large it felt completely surreal. I logged into the central network and officially transferred the administrative rights of the compliance algorithm over to the corporate technology team. I released the software lock, allowing the company to finally process the $50 million cargo ship waiting out in the Pacific Ocean. But releasing the software did not mean releasing them from the consequences of their actions. Isaac closed my laptop, gently handed me a glass of champagne, and reminded me that the corporate bleeding might have stopped, but the federal hammer was just about to fall. Isaac was absolutely right. Fast forward a few weeks, and the harsh reality of the situation came crashing down on Richard and his board of directors. Just because they bought my software and cleared the immediate backlog at the port of Long Beach did not mean the United States government was going to simply look the other way. My sister-in-law Simone is a woman of incredible integrity, and she takes her job as a federal auditor very seriously. Trent had committed unauthorized import smuggling when he tried to digitally bypass the locked gates, and Simone ensured that the law was followed to the absolute letter. She launched a full-scale comprehensive audit into the entire corporate logistics network. For weeks, federal agents swarmed the company headquarters, pulling hard drives, interviewing terrified dispatchers, and tearing through years of financial records. They found every single corner Trent had cut, every single safety regulation he had blatantly ignored, and every single dollar he had tried to save by bypassing international rules. The company was completely exposed to the unforgiving light of federal scrutiny. The resulting penalty was entirely unprecedented. The Customs and Border Protection Agency hit the corporation with a massive, highly publicized federal fine for severe compliance breaches and attempted smuggling. It was not a quiet settlement swept under the rug by expensive lawyers. It was a multi-million-dollar penalty that made front-page headlines in every major logistics and trade publication across the country. The entire industry watched in absolute shock as one of the most prominent supply chain empires was publicly humiliated and forced to pay exorbitant fines just to keep their operating licenses active. Several of their largest international clients immediately terminated their contracts, refusing to be associated with a company under federal investigation for smuggling. The board of directors, who had been so furious in that virtual meeting, were now dealing with plummeting stock prices and a total loss of investor confidence. Richard had managed to keep his title as chief executive officer for the moment, but his absolute power was entirely gone. He was now heavily monitored by a strict federal oversight committee, and his personal legacy was permanently stained by the massive scandal. He had saved his company from immediate bankruptcy, but he had lost his reputation, his dignity, and his total control. But the most profound and deeply satisfying consequence of all fell squarely onto Trent. When Richard fired him on that live video feed, he did not just strip him of his unvested shares and his fancy executive title. He essentially threw his son out of the only protective bubble he had ever known. Trent suddenly found himself in the real world, a harsh world where his last name meant absolutely nothing, and his actions had severe, permanent consequences. He tried to brush off the humiliating firing, assuming he could just walk into another senior executive position at a rival firm. He updated his resume, put on his tailored suits, and started taking meetings with other logistics companies in the city. But he quickly discovered that the corporate logistics world is incredibly small, and terrible news travels exceptionally fast. The story of his catastrophic ego-driven text message had become an open secret in the industry. It was the ultimate cautionary tale shared in boardrooms and corporate dining halls. Everyone knew exactly why the federal government had raided his father's company. Everyone knew that Trent was the arrogant vice president who fired his chief compliance officer on her wedding day and accidentally locked his own $50 million shipment out of the country. Nobody wanted absolutely anything to do with him. He became a complete corporate pariah. Chief executive officers at other companies openly laughed at his applications. Human resources departments flagged and blacklisted his name from their hiring systems. He was viewed as a walking liability, a dangerous man whose monumental stupidity could bring federal agents knocking on their doors. He could not secure a job anywhere in the supply chain industry. Without his massive corporate salary, the facade of his wealthy lifestyle quickly crumbled. The customized sports car his father had bought for him was quietly returned to the dealership. His luxury downtown apartment was put up for sale. Trent was forced to realize that without his father constantly cleaning up his messes, he was completely unemployable. He had spent years treating hard-working people like they were entirely disposable, and now the industry had collectively decided to dispose of him. It was the purest form of poetic justice. He had tried to ruin my life with a single text message, and instead he had systematically dismantled his own future, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the bitter memory of his own incredible arrogance. The warm tropical breeze of the Indian Ocean gently swept across the private wooden deck of our overwater villa in the Maldives. It had been exactly 1 month since that chaotic wedding weekend, and the air here smelled like salt water and absolute freedom. I was reclining on a plush white sunbed wearing a comfortable linen cover-up and listening to the rhythmic sound of the crystal-clear waves gently lapping against the wooden stilts beneath us. A few feet away, Isaac was floating on his back, in our private infinity pool, wearing dark sunglasses and holding a tall tropical drink with a tiny paper umbrella. He looked completely at peace, taking a well-deserved break from dismantling corporate empires in the courtroom. There were no frantic phone calls ringing in the background. There were no desperate text messages from arrogant executives. There was only the sound of the ocean and the profound, satisfying quiet of a brand new life. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the warm sun on my skin, and reached for the silver laptop resting on the small glass table next to my chair. Opening a laptop on a luxury honeymoon might seem like a terrible idea to most people, but for me, it was the ultimate victory lap. I was not opening it to check the global supply chain manifests or to put out any logistical fires. I did not care what was happening at my former company. The federal investigations, the public relations nightmares, and the massive maritime fines were no longer my problem to solve. Instead, I opened my secure email inbox to review the final incorporation documents for my brand new independent logistics and compliance consultancy. I scrolled through the digital pages reading the brilliant legal clauses that Isaac had meticulously drafted for me. This time, I was not signing my rights away to an ungrateful employer. I was the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole owner of my own intellectual property. I set my own hours, I chose my own clients, and I dictated my own absolute worth. The documents were flawless, completely protecting my patents and ensuring that nobody would ever have the power to fire me via a petty text message ever again. I digitally signed the final page and officially brought my new company to life. But the most incredibly satisfying part of the morning was not just registering the business. It was reviewing the very first signed contract waiting in my inbox. It was a massive multi-million-dollar annual retainer agreement, and the signature at the bottom of the document did not belong to Richard. A few days after our dramatic confrontation in the hotel business center, the board of directors finally realized that Richard had completely lost his ability to lead. His blind devotion to his son Trent had cost the investors too much money and destroyed their pristine reputation in the logistics industry. The board forced Richard into an involuntary early retirement, stripping him of his executive power and pushing him out of the empire he had spent 30 long years building. The corporation was now under new, strict management, directed entirely by the conservative board members. And their very first order of business was to ensure their compliance network never collapsed again. Because my severance agreement legally allowed me to operate independently, they had absolutely no choice but to come crawling back to me. I looked at the numbers on the screen. The board of directors had just hired my new consultancy firm to manage their federal compliance software as an external contractor. But without the leverage of being my employer, they had to agree to my strict independent pricing structure. I was now charging them exactly 3 times my former annual salary for half the amount of work. They had to agree to a rigorous communication protocol, meaning they could not call me after business hours, and they certainly could not demand immediate off-the-clock favors. They were paying a massive premium for the safety and security of my algorithm, and they were happy to do it. It was the absolute perfect revenge. I was making more money than I ever thought possible, working strictly on my own terms and holding the ultimate leverage over the exact same people who had allowed me to be mistreated for so many years. I did not have to scream or fight or compromise my professionalism to win. I just had to know my own value and let their own breathtaking incompetence destroy them. I finished reviewing the lucrative retainer agreement, closed the digital file, and let out a soft, contented sigh. I reached forward and slowly pressed the silver laptop screen down until it clicked shut with a deeply satisfying snap. I slid the computer back onto the glass table and picked up my own tropical drink, taking a slow, refreshing sip of the sweet, cold juice. Isaac swam over to the edge of the infinity pool, resting his muscular arms on the cool, wet tiles, and looked up at me with a brilliant, knowing smile. He asked me if all the legal paperwork was finally finished and if I was officially a self-made executive. I smiled back at him, feeling a radiant sense of pure joy spreading through my entire chest. I told him that the paperwork was completely done and the first check had already cleared the bank. We had officially won the war. I leaned my head back against the plush white cushion and looked out at the endless expanse of the bright blue ocean stretching out to the horizon. It is truly amazing how life works. On the evening of my wedding, when I first looked down at my phone and saw Trent's text message telling me I was fired, I felt a brief moment of panic. He had intended to ruin my special day, to humiliate me in front of my family, and to assert his unearned dominance. But sitting here on this beautiful tropical island, surrounded by luxury, and feeling completely financially secure, I realized the absolute truth. That cruel, arrogant text message was not a punishment at all. It was the necessary catalyst that finally pushed me out of a highly toxic environment and forced me to realize my own incredible potential. Trent had told me to consider the termination as his wedding gift to me. I took another sip of my drink, watching the gentle waves roll by, and smiled entirely to myself. He was absolutely right, absolutely. It was without a doubt the greatest, most profitable wedding gift I could have ever possibly received. The most powerful lesson you can take away from my story is that your absolute value does not decrease simply because someone else lacks the capacity to see it. For 5 long years, I poured my entire effort into a company that fundamentally disrespected me. I allowed myself to be managed by a deeply incompetent man simply because I believed that loyalty and hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. I was completely wrong. Toxic people and corporate enablers do not reward hard work. They exploit it. They rely entirely on your fear of conflict and your dedication to keep their broken systems running smoothly. When you are the smartest person in the room, working for the most arrogant people in the room, you are not building a solid career. You are simply building your own prison. The turning point in my life was not just the moment I was fired. The true turning point was the moment I stopped trying to save those people from themselves. When you remove your protective hands and let incompetent individuals face the natural consequences of their own actions, the universe has a brilliant way of restoring balance. You do not always need to seek loud, messy revenge. Sometimes the absolute best revenge is stepping back, establishing ironclad boundaries, and letting their own monumental arrogance become the exact weapon that destroys them. When you finally realize your own worth and refuse to accept anything less, you become completely untouchable. If you have ever felt undervalued, underpaid, or taken for granted by an employer, or even a toxic family member, I want you to remember this story. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you are ready to stop shrinking yourself to fit into rooms where you do not belong. Share this video with someone who desperately needs a reminder that their skills and their peace of mind are incredibly valuable. Tell me in the comments below about a time when you finally walked away from a toxic situation and let the natural consequences take over. Your greatest victory might just be one firm boundary away. Stay strong, stay brilliant, and never ever apologize for knowing your true worth.